I don't claim to be any kind of expert on attention deficit disorder. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a professor. I have a degree in psychology, but in 4 years' time, we spent about 20 minutes on ADD. But in the last 10 years, especially after school, I went to 3 different high schools and 3 different colleges. I have had 10 different addresses in 4 different cities. Filed for bankruptcy when I was 26. Spent 5 months in Alaska as a nomad. Matt called me up and said, hey, I got a business proposition for you. And his idea was to go to Alaska, work on the fishing boats, and make all kinds of money. So even though that night I told him I'd have to think about it, I mean, within the first 10 minutes I was decided I was going. That's the danger right there, is you forget and you don't think about common sense factors. You just get so impulsive and you get so driven to do whatever the hell you want to do. You're not going to listen to anybody's advice on anything. You're not going to get any, it doesn't matter what people have done in the past. You want to do what you want to do. And that can be a strength and that can be a weakness. For me, it's usually been a weakness, just because I haven't noticed it. Next question. So, all these little things combined doesn't make me an expert on ADD, but I have lived with it my entire life. When Matt called me about going to Alaska, I was working about 4 jobs at the same time. I was juggling working as a stuntman, I was working at Disney as a character, I was a substitute teacher, and I was a taxi driver. You know, the spontaneity that comes with ADD, it's great in the respect that it got me to Alaska. I mean, you know, and it helped me do a lot of things that I've wanted to do. But, as it says in the key criteria, got no follow-through. So even though I went to Alaska and I lived there for 5 months and had this great adventure, I never met my true original goal. It's not, the way it's affected me is not been good. It's not helped me. A short while before I was diagnosed with ADD, I was staying with a friend of mine in North Carolina. And he had gone away for the weekend. When he came back, he kind of told me that he'd been a little worried about leaving me alone in the house because he had a gun in the house. That was when I went back to visit Matt. Matt's the guy I went to Alaska with. We've been friends for 10 years. I don't think, after spending 5 months living in a tent together, nobody knows me better than Matt. And he'd been diagnosed with ADD about 3 years ago, and when he told me then, I was a little skeptical about it, you know. It was always a kid's disorder for me, and I was just skeptical of the whole thing, the whole just people being that hyperactive or impulsive or whatever, that it would create a disorder. I don't know, it just seemed kind of, I don't know, hinky, I guess that's the word.
Attention deficit disorder for me comes when we see kids particularly, but certainly it can occur with adults as well, who have difficulty concentrating.
Feelings of being overwhelmed.
Difficulty handling more than one task at a time.
Tend to be easily distracted.
And it can lead to problems with impulsivity.
Particularly the dyad of inability to focus and pay attention, and then inability to inhibit impulses are the 2 main things.
You can see it in disorganization, and it's a persistent pattern of these things that happen over and over again that make it ADD.
I call it zigzag a lot. You know, instead of going from point A to B, you zigzag to get there, your thought processes.
Now, a lot of people have difficulty with focusing or might be kind of impulsive, but until that becomes a significant difficulty in their lives, it's not ADD, it's just being human.
The term ADD, attention deficit disorder, I think is also controversial. The trend now seems to be that we should really be thinking of it in terms of an attention inconsistency disorder.
Well, I think the attention is deficit as far as not being able to stay focused on one thing, but I think basically there's too much stimuli coming in and attention is going everywhere. So there's a lot of attention all over the place, kind of a hypervigilance of the environment.
Essentially, I think it has to do with the functioning of the brain. That individuals with ADD have been shown to have certain portions of the brain that function in a more sluggish way than other parts of the brain. And that can lead to difficulties or challenges in many areas.
The bottom line for any kind of disorder is that it's something that disrupts someone's life, that it's dysfunctional. for someone in terms of their work or going to school or their relationships with other people.
We're getting much more information so that we can identify people who have a mild version of that. And what we're finding is that even with mild versions of this creates a real challenge and a lot of stress for people who have this.
We started talking about ADD and how it's affected him and things he's done to better his life just by knowing about it. And we started going through the criteria for it. He had a book called Driven to Distraction, and it lists 20 diagnostic criteria for attention deficit disorder. So we went through those, and each one I was just going, yeah, that's me, that's me, that's me. It seemed like Doctors Hollowell and Rady, the guys who wrote the book, it seemed like they'd been following me around for a few years. At the end of the list, I said, well, how many did I get right? You know, he's checking them off as I go, and he said 17. So, 17 out of 20 was pretty high, and I asked him how many he got right when he was, matched up with when he was diagnosed, and he said 15. So that was when I first started looking into it, figuring maybe I haven't screwed up so many times just because I'm lazy or stupid or unmotivated, but maybe there really is something I need to look into. When I found out I got ADD, I was just at a point in my life where I was miserable, honestly. I was living in this little dump of a house in Wilmington where I didn't know anybody except Dean, and Dean was moving. And this house was terrible. I mean, the floors were just warped, wooden, and I had these metal balls, those little balls you twist around in your hand, Asian balls, you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. I had those things, and I would put one on the floor, and it would just roll. And it went across this floor, because it was so crooked, and all the floor was warped, it would just go boom, 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 across the floor. It was bad there. Within that month, I had gotten 3 tickets, so I'm currently, even now, I'm 3 points away from a suspended license. The gas line was ruptured or something, so I had no heat, had no hot water. The bathtub was just disgusting because it was warped. The whole floor was warped, so this place in the back of it collected all this water, and all kinds of funky stuff was growing in there. For the next month, I was just living in misery. I got a knife in my hand. It's a good idea to talk about depression. And I started thinking back to what Dean had said about Thanksgiving and him actually being worried about me being alone with a gun. I really never thought I had a problem with depression. I never really thought I was at a point in my life where my life was that bad. Or I just started thinking, what if? Didn't make any plans for it, but thought, this is really it. I've reached the bottom. And it kind of helped me put things into perspective, that my life was that bad where other people would just give up. And it made me realize that, I've got to start making things better. It was the first time in my life where I thought suicide would not be that bad a thing. That really made me stop and think about what was going on and what needed to be changed. So that was one of the key factors in me moving back to Sarasota, getting some treatment for ADD, and finding out where I lost control of my life and where I can start again. And that whole last 10 years was pretty much just getting away from my hometown. And when it came to the point when I finally said, you know what, I need some help. I can't do this anymore. I can't live like this anymore. That's when I had to come home and be with my family, be with my friends, and just be where I grew up in a place that would just help me learn about myself. Within like the month, I moved back here to Sarasota, which is my hometown, and after 10 years of going from one end of the country to the other, trying to make something of myself, I finally came back to my roots to piece my life together again. The first thing I wanted to do was find out what it was and how I could get rid of it, because obviously it hadn't been working for me very well. So I spent a lot of time in libraries, on the internet, anywhere I could find any kind of information on what was going on in my life. That's where I looked. And found all kinds of information on it. And when that wasn't enough, and I still wasn't finding enough stuff and wasn't getting enough help, I started calling everybody in town who specialized in it. Just got the yellow pages out and started going through there looking at therapists and social workers and doctors and nurses and anybody who specialized in ADD who could help me out, give me some advice, give me some more knowledge about it. I went to them.
A lot of adults are not diagnosed, or they think they've grown out of it and they haven't. So they present with the problems of difficulty holding jobs, can't stay in school. Depression's very common because of the energy it takes to try and accomplish things, and the frustration. The person so often feels like they're inadequate.
One of the things I see probably most often in young adults is kind of a social anxiety, because what a lot of people describe is having a hard time focusing on people when they're talking to them, losing track of where they are in the conversation, or someone's telling them something and they start thinking about something else and their mind is off, and so when they come back with a response, it has nothing to do with what the person was just talking about, or just peripherally.
From early on, from childhood, these people are criticized frequently by teachers, parents. What they say to me frequently is we're told to pay attention, and they know they forget frequently, forget. And they get criticized incessantly while they're growing up.
And so the people that I've worked with most they become kind of fearful about going into social situations. They're afraid they're going to say the wrong thing, or they're going to come across as cold or distant or uncaring. They're not going to know how to handle themselves. They're going to say something that they didn't mean to say.
They're not able to follow through on task, stay that focused. And then they try multiple jobs, and don't really know where to put their energy. And it's manifested kind of in a lost feeling, don't know where they belong.
A lot of substance abuse, because in some ways, any kind of mood-altering kind of drug or alcohol can, in some ways, kind of mimic being in an altered state where people feel like, I can pay attention now, and I can focus, and I can be normal. They may or may not be doing that, but they feel like it.
With the advent of MRI research, where we're actually able to look at the brain being activated and which centers of the brain activate at what rate, we're really able to document the neurological basis to attention deficit disorder.
20 years ago, we were calling it some kind of I can't think the name of it.
Minimal brain dysfunction.
Thank you. Minimal brain dysfunction.
And the more we see about the interaction between brain chemicals and brain development and behavior, so that one impacts the other. Okay? I mean, it's so very interesting to me. This is related, not directly related to ADHD, but you look at people who have experienced trauma, and their brain chemicals are different. The trauma impacts the chemicals in their brain, which then impacts back their behavior, which then impacts back the brain chemicals.
I also think, honestly in my heart, that Nintendo, computer games, video games, cause a lot of the inattention problems we see today. The amount of time kids spend in front of TV, I think the wave patterns in the brain are definitely affected by the hyper-concentration given to Nintendo and games like that, video games. And the amount of time a kid sits in front of the TV is something like, I don't have the statistics right now, but it's an inordinate, like 2 hours a day, the average kid in this country, and that does something to your brainwaves.
This brain phenomenon, this neurological situation, doesn't just appear in its most extreme form. There are gradations of that. And so as we open ourselves more to working with individuals who have a milder form, we are going to be diagnosing more people with attention deficit disorder. But it's absolutely necessary if we want to help people who are suffering from depression and anxiety because of this underlying problem.
There are also some kids who get missed. especially kids who might be kind of big for their age and just seem like they're bullies and they're bad and they're mean, when in fact they're none of those things. They have a disorder. Kids with ADD without the hyperactivity, I think they can get overlooked a lot, particularly girls, because they're the apples of teachers' eyes. They're quiet and compliant and sweet, and they just sit and they, unfortunately, generally looking out the window and daydreaming and not getting their work done, but at least they're quiet. They're not bugging anybody. And again, if they happen to be fairly bright, then they can compensate for that. And they can hear something once and memorize it and regurgitate it on a test. They don't need to be listening all the time. So I think you see that quite a bit.
A lot of times with the behavioral problems, ADHD may be overdiagnosed. There may be more anxiety there, than actual ADD. But without the behavioral problem, I think it's very underdiagnosed. And I think that's how you get all the way through school and you don't find out till you're an adult and you either have a drug problem or you read a book and go, oh, there I am.
If you do just ignore this, you should expect that you will see other things pop up. Around 16, 17, 18 years old, that kids will start having a lot of problems in one area or another, whether it's substance abuse or depression, anxiety. You can only go through life for so long being a failure or feeling like a failure before you have other symptoms.
Well, first of all, usually as an adolescent with the impulsivity, they'll start getting into some legal trouble.
People with ADD are impulsive, don't follow rules. Biggie, they don't follow rules. They don't do what they're supposed to do. They're risk takers. So it doesn't surprise me that there's a high population of ADD people in jail, because these are the people that have a whole bunch of speeding tickets, maybe abuse problems. Drug abuse and alcohol abuse is a huge problem in the ADD population. So right there, that's probably half our prison population related to substance abuse.
There's a correlation between ADHD and then in children oppositional defiant disorder, which oftentimes progresses to conduct disorder.
When they get discouraged and they get frustrated and they give up and they get angry, then they're in jail.
Adults I've met a lot, even that say they're illiterate. What they really did was they acted out and quit school because that was more acceptable. It's more acceptable to be a renegade than it is to be a failure.
For many individuals, it doesn't have to be a disability. It can be a challenge. It helps for them to know where these particular weaknesses or strengths are. They're not disabled. They may function in every venue that they need to, yet still have a mild attention deficit disorder. However, for other individuals, it clearly can be a disability where it can profoundly affect their functioning.
What the hell are you looking for tonight?
I'm looking for my old psychology book.
Why?
Because I want to find out what I learned in college about ADD. Because I don't think there was much when I was in college that we talked about this thing. When I was in college, they always said, don't self-diagnose. The first thing they ever told you when you went into abnormal psych is do not self-diagnose. So I ended up with a degree in psychology and never knew about ADD, the fact that I might possibly have it. All these books that I've been reading, as I'm reading them, they're like, wow. When they describe a person with ADD, they're like describing me. These kind of books are written about me. Whenever I read them and they describe the ADD type, what this person is like, it's me, and someone has written a book. These people have spent their lives, devoted their lives to studying me. So if you're diagnosed with ADD, you're actually in a pretty fortunate place because you've got books written by people who have designated years of their lives to studying people who think exactly the way you think. And for me, that's a great thing because I don't learn from my own mistakes very well. It takes someone to smack me upside the head for me to learn anything because I'm very stubborn, and that's kind of a running symptom of ADD. When I read the criteria, and I'll just read them real quickly here. One is a sense of underachievement, of not meeting one's goals, regardless of how much one has actually accomplished. Difficulty getting organized, chronic procrastination or trouble getting started. Many projects going simultaneously, trouble with follow-through. Tendency to say what comes to mind without necessarily considering the timing or appropriateness of the remark. A frequent search for high stimulation. An intolerance of boredom. Easy distractibility, trouble focusing attention. Tendency to tune out or drift away in the middle of a page or a conversation, often coupled with an ability to hyperfocus at times. Often creative, intuitive, and highly intelligent. Trouble in going through established channels, following the proper procedure. Impatient, low tolerance for frustration. Impulsive, either verbally or in action, as an impulsive spending of money, changing plans, enacting new schemes or career plans, and the like. Tendency to worry needlessly, endlessly. Tendency to scan the horizon looking for something to worry about, alternating with inattention to or disregard for actual dangers. A sense of insecurity. Mood swings, mood lability. Restlessness. Tendency toward addictive behavior. Chronic problems with self-esteem. Inaccurate self-observation, and family history of ADD or a related disorder. But every time I read these, I get one of two responses. One will be, that sounds just like me, or that sounds just like somebody else.
I see people go through really interesting transitions. It's almost a process that they go through when they begin to explore whether they have attention deficit disorder or not. For many of them, this is an enormous relief when someone finally can explain to them why they think the way that they do. And for many of them, they begin to backtrack through experiences in their life, in their recollection, and they begin to look at that in a different way. For many of them, it is such a boost. Ironically, it's a boost to their self-esteem. We're telling them good news and bad news. The good news is that there is something wrong. The bad news is that it is ADD, but it doesn't have to be bad news either.
But now it explains so much why I could never figure out math when I was a kid. I mean, I would come home from school and work on my math problems and just cry because I could not get it. And it was the most frustrating thing. English or whatever, writing stories and yes, no problem.
What are the good things that you have, buddy?
Some of the good things, creativity, I think is a very good thing. I enjoy the painting and sculpting and writing and can always think of different ways to say things and different ways to portray myself and my thoughts. So those are the good things. The penchant I have for trying things that no one else would try or would think of.
They like stimulating ideas. They go in search of interesting ideas and interesting stories.
Their options, they can see themselves doing a lot of different things.
And so they can be very interesting people to be around.
Usually intelligent. And part of this frustration, they are multi-talented, so then you've got the thing that which one to go for and what to do with it.
They say that Ernest Hemingway had ADD. But of course they didn't diagnose it back then because it really didn't exist as a disorder. So I don't know if that means anything. They also say that Thomas Edison had ADD and Benjamin Franklin. All these people who were somewhat scattered and did a lot of stuff with their life, they call it ADD. I was talking to a therapist, a doctor, and he kind of said that was hogwash. Simply for the fact that attention deficit disorder is a disorder. It's when there's a dysfunction, when there's something wrong. So you can't really say that someone as successful as Thomas Edison had neurological disorder because it worked to his advantage. But if Thomas Edison had the same traits I do, and Ben Franklin had the same traits I do, and they succeeded in their life, the main thing I want to do is find out how they did it. How these traits can actually work for people's good. How can it be beneficial? And make those things happen for myself. so that instead of being a disorder, it's a strength. And I think that's possible. My strongest strength is the fact that I can see the world in a way that nobody else does. And I think that's for everybody with ADD. Our minds work differently. You know, down to the neurological level, all the doctors will say that it works differently. Now, how that plays into real life, especially in my own life, is I can see things that other people can't. I can find ways to do things that other people would never dream of. On ways to do this project, on ways to work with art, ways to deal with people, ways to get things accomplished. Now, they may not always work because I don't have the follow-through to do it. That's where another strength lies, is the fact that I can see these things, but I have to hand it off to other people. I have to get help from other people in order to bring any idea I have into fruition. And that's just a realization of the fact that you're not in this world alone, that you've got family and you've got friends, and they can help you do what you need to do. And you need to find people who can complement your own weaknesses and your own strengths. The point is, though, that there are different types of these things, that all of us are different in our own way. But I think to classify it all anymore as just a disorder is very short-sighted. You know, to call ADD a disorder, which by definition it is very short-sighted. I think that this entire group of people, some are very, very successful, and you get other people who are just failures because they can't use their talents. They don't know themselves well enough to use their skills effectively. But you got the same thing with everybody in the world. That you've got people who do think very well and do study well in classes, and can think like the farmer type people, but they fail too. You know, it's everybody. Every group of people is going to have their share of failures. And their share of successes. You know, I mean, for whatever reason, I'm this way I'm just this way. It can be a good thing, the same as the hyperfocus. When I can focus on an idea, write about something, or a project like this one and focus on it, it's very good for the project. The only problem is, because of that attention and consistency, I forget everything else.
Hyperfocusing is paying attention to something to the point of tuning out everything else in the environment and focusing on just what you're looking at very, very intensely.
Overfocusing and hyperfocusing can be an enormous skill to many kinds of professionals. As a psychologist, I couldn't ask for a better skill because it allows me to really focus in on what my clients are having to say to me. And truly, I could have a blizzard outside my window, and there are times when I would not be aware of that because of the ability to hyperfocus.
You will find people with ADD who function actually quite well in their jobs, as long as they're given one thing at a time to do. If they have one project to do, they'll get totally into that one project to the exclusion of everything else. And so that project will be very good. Now, unfortunately, what that often means is that their family life suffers, their social life suffers, their physical health may suffer, because there is the ability to get very focused into one thing.
Many of the adults that I see who have the attention deficit disorder with hyperactivity have higher levels of productivity. They really pack a lot into a day, and they get up the next day and the same thing happens. So that's a real plus.
Can you really get behind a cause? You know, a lot of leadership ability once they get focused, because they're strong survivors.
I think another one of the Tom Hartman stories that best brings this to light is when he was in India. He was traveling by train and met up with some Hindu businessmen, and he started asking them about people with ADD. He described the type of person they were and asked them if they had people like that in their culture. And this they said, oh yeah, we consider them very holy men, and they're at the end of their karmic cycle, so they're trying to grab all of life that they can. You know, they're almost finished, almost home, so they're just trying to enjoy everything. And they consider that holy. They consider those guys holy. And at first when I read that, it made me laugh. But, you know, because I really don't know anything about Hinduism. But I liked that idea. So I've studied a little bit since then. I like the idea that something that we consider to be a disorder, they consider to be a gift, you know, and it's all about perspective. It's all about, you can look at this as you have a disorder and you're going to be debilitated for the rest of your life, or you can look at it like, I think differently, that's the way it is, let's find out how I can make this work for me. I can figure problems out that other people, normal people, can't get. That's my, the sixth sense, I guess you could say, that we have. You know, we're very intuitive, usually very intelligent, at least I am. And, you know, we're creative because of that. You know, I may not be able to do math worth squat, but I can build a better mousetrap.
The positive aspect of ADHD, I think, is to challenge us as folks who work in this field to find better ways of working with these kids and to find better ways of meeting their needs and playing to their strengths rather than to say you need a pill to take care of that because it's a bad thing.
Anytime someone receives a diagnosis, it's devastating. It's hard to hear that there's something wrong with you. But I think it's real important to find out about it as much as you can, figure out what you can do and how you can channel whatever strengths you have in a positive direction. Because I think that can always happen. No matter what the diagnosis, there are always going to be strengths that can be built upon. And a lot of times that's where therapy comes in, is to be able to identify those things.
Correct terminology, as is in the DSM right now, is ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. For me, I say ADD because I don't really show any hyperactivity. I'm not bouncing off the walls, never was as a kid. I wasn't a problem child. Skipped school a couple times, did the hooky thing, but went to a psychiatrist for once after one of the hooky incidences, and we played checkers or something, and that was about the extent of it. So the medical community kind of let me skip by because I wasn't causing any problems. You know, you have the ones in school who are caught with it, who they show their hyperactivity and they become a nuisance in the classroom. The teachers bring this up to the parents, and the kid is usually able to be, it's able to be discovered that he's got this disorder. But with the ones like me, who are just the daydreamers, the ones who sit at their desk and look out the window at the leaves falling and the birds singing and don't really cause any problem, it's kind of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So, you know, kids like myself get overlooked and they find themselves in adulthood struggling with this thing, and they don't know why.
The important thing to remember, I think, and the more that we find out about ADHD, I think this becomes truer and truer along with other disorders, is that it's treatable.
With attention deficit disorder, if we could boil it all down into simple strategies, I think the most important one is structure. Structure, structure, structure. Organization, organization, organization. It sounds simple, but it's really hard to do.
But it is overwhelming at first, and I think the hope is if you can tackle it initially, it's not going to be a problem, and the whole rest of your life is going to be easier.
So the treatment is really a combination of things, including some individual therapy with a child perhaps. It's going to be on a shorter term basis. Family therapy to work with the child and the parents' interaction with each other. We're going to be spending some time with the parents to do some education, to teach them about what ADHD is all about, and again to talk to them about how to best formulate their responses, their interaction, their relationship with the child in their home environment.
There's no magic wand, there's no magic pill, but the combination of treatment modalities together, therapy, medicine, knowledge, learning what's going on in yourself, psychoeducation, educating your children. Maybe there's not a cure, but there's definitely a way to learn to live with it and accept it.
With children, I encourage parents to always weigh the issue of self-esteem. If a child's self-esteem is suffering because of what they're having to do to manage their ADD, I get rather vehement about encouraging them to try medicine. Because when you start sacrificing and losing out on the self-esteem, it's very hard to restore that.
You don't ever want them to not be themselves. You don't medicate them to that point. You just want it to be functional.
A lot of individuals remain reluctant to try medication. It still is an individual choice. I encourage people to try medicine because, as I said, I think it has a direct route to the source of the problem.
Once it's identified and you acknowledge that it is a problem, I think there's a trial period. You should start very low dose, see if it's beneficial, and then it's your decision. The medication generally takes effect quickly, so it's nothing that you have to have a 6-month trial on. You could try it, see what difference it made, and it's feedback from other people is exceptionally important because a lot of people I don't notice any difference, but the people they live with, their wives, teachers, employers even, can give them the feedback that you are much different. It's much, much better now.
Well, I guess the main thing is not just with ADD, but with any kind of disorder, whether it's a psychiatric disorder or a medical disorder, a learning disability, anything. The most important thing is getting as much information about it as you can and trying to be as objective about it as you can. I think this is really hard for parents of a child who has any kind of ADHD, LD, psychiatric problem, is there's just so much understandable desire to deny it and not want to have to deal with it and say, are you sure, isn't there something else? And that keeps them from then learning about it and being able to help themselves. And it's kind of like what I was saying before, you're not responsible for having a disorder, but you are responsible for learning about it and taking care of yourself.
What I would suggest for any parent who feels like their child may be affected by ADHD, and whether they have funds or not, but to seek out a counseling center or an individual practitioner, depending on what you can afford, to provide a good assessment.
You can go to a health department and get that diagnosis now or get it looked at. Mental health agencies in your community can look at it now. Most psychiatrists are trained to see ADD, at least in children. Some are trained in adults. There's usually something around in every community where somebody can go with a Medicaid card, no insurance. An indigent population can be treated in most communities.
Talk to a lot of therapists and ask them, do you work with ADHD? And you can ask people, do you believe in ADHD? I mean, I think there are people who don't believe in ADHD for adults. It's like, that's a kid thing. I can't tell you how many times a parent will tell me, well, their middle school child or high school child was told by a guidance counselor, you're too old for this ADHD stuff. Now, you don't have ADHD, you're too old. So I think it's important to ask, do you work with with particular diagnosis, and how do you work with this particular diagnosis, and do you believe in it?
In terms of the treatment of attention deficit disorder, the most comprehensive approach is going to be the best. It's very important to have coordination among the therapist, the family, whether it's adult or children, or in many, many instances, it's adults and children within the same families.
I think this is sort of philosophical, but I think there's always been kind of a struggle for people in this country between what things are kind of amenable to free will and moral strivings. Like if you want to overcome this, you should be able to, Now we know that, like, let's say someone has diabetes, you don't, by an act of will, overcome your diabetes. So it's sort of, why would you expect that by an act of will you would overcome your ADHD? Certainly it does take an act of will that is the same in both cases to go see a doctor, to learn about your disorder, to learn about what you have to do to take care of yourself. So certainly in that way, there is a moral will aspect to it. You have to take responsibility for having a disorder and for taking care of yourself.
It's really important to educate yourself as much as possible about ADD if you suspect that you have it or if you've been diagnosed with it. It's all about self-understanding and self-awareness.
There are all kinds of facets to this that we're still continuing to discover every day. And I think what we're discovering is either a new way of thinking or an old way of thinking that's just been ignored for too long. You know, I mean, you look at the numbers, and I've heard anywhere from 6 million people to 25 million people in America have been diagnosed with ADD or have ADD. You know, I mean, it can be anywhere from 5% to a quarter. You know, I mean, that's just a lot of people. And that just seems too high for me to just consider it a disorder. You know, that's a subculture. This is kind of just a different way of thinking through and through that I don't really think it is that much of a disorder. I think I kind of agree with the Tom Hartman's theory that somehow, genetically, either be this the evolution of the species or whatever, that we're thinking, our brains are thinking differently because humankind is in need of that type person. I don't think this is something we can just medicate away. And I don't think we should medicate it away. I think there are a lot of strengths that go along with ADD. You know, I've still only had it for 7 months, and there's still a lot about it that I don't understand and I don't know. And I'm still trying to get a better grip on in my own life. So it's hard for me to say what exactly my strengths are, because it's a journey. The point is that you do have a lot of gifts, and you need to find out what they are. And if you're not happy in your life, then you need to change that, because that's what life is about. If you're not enjoying it, you need to start. I think the key to the whole thing is the simple Socratic wisdom, is know thyself. Once you know yourself and you know your strengths and you know your weaknesses and you know that time and time again, when you look at your life now, you can see mistakes you've made. When you know what's not working for you, when you know what is working for you, when you know what you like and you know what you don't, then you can build a life. You know, and the people who have attention deficit disorder and have made a success of themselves, the people like that I've heard read lists like Thomas Edison and Benjamin Franklin, that they couldn't be diagnosed, had the same traits. Those people knew themselves, and they knew what they needed to do to make themselves a success. And part of it was trial and error. Part of it, through that trial and error, they learned how to succeed. And for a lot of us, we lack that wisdom. We lack the insight to really know ourselves. And we continue to make the same mistakes again and again and again. I know I have. What I've learned is that there's still a lot that they don't know about ADD. There's still a lot that is a lot of conjecture. We don't know what causes it. We don't know how it starts. And we don't know how to cure it. But there's a lot that can be done for treatment. There are these type books that describe the disorder, the best ways to deal with it from a clinical perspective. They have books out there that show that other people with ADD have written and shown structuring ideas that help them in their life. They have devotional books for people with ADD. I mean, there's so much information out there on how to live your life better, on little steps to help you become a better person. The study of ADD started with hyperactivity in the 1970s, continued on into the 80s, making hyperactivity the most studied children's disorder in history. You know, this is not a little thing. This is not something that can be swept under the rug, like a lot of skeptics say it can be. A lot of people say that hyperactivity is it's something kids do. You know, kids are hyper, they're rambunctious, they're inquisitive, and they think that that's enough. But this thing is affecting people where they live on a daily basis. And it's not something we can just shrug our shoulders at and say it'll get better. It's something that we have to look into.